Okay, welcome all to today's Oxford Public Philosophy Critical Discussion Group. And we're very lucky to have Alice Crary here. And before we start, I would just like to make a statement about how this is a space for open and accessible critical discussion. And a space cannot be open and accessible without being in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. OPP and the other critical philosophy groups of Oxford will be releasing a statement in support of the Black Lives Matter movement shortly and condemning the murder of George Floyd and institutional anti-Blackness. We wouldn't be happy giving a talk today that did not echo the anti-racist sentiments of radicals in social thought. And so with that, I would like to introduce this talk given by Alice Crary, who is University Distinguished Professor at the New School for Social Research in New York and Visiting Fellow at Regent's Park College, Oxford. She's also an academic advisor to Oxford Public Philosophy and helped thoroughly in its foundation. The title of her talk will be Letter to a Young Philosopher, Don't Become an Effective Altruist. Over to you, Alice.
Thank you very much, Ashley. I'm very pleased to be giving a talk here, and I want to just echo parts of Ashley's introduction because this talk, Ashley knows that it's something, and I'll explain, I'm working on it right now, just finished it, but I wouldn't be comfortable giving it right now if it wasn't about opening up philosophy so that it's more in conversation with social movements like Black Lives Matter. It's the kind of thing I'd like to be doing right now. And I do especially want to thank Ashley for her time and energy in setting this up, because it is quite a lot of work, even though it seems so simple when it finally runs, partly because of the work she puts into it. I'm reading a short text, which is written just for this discussion session, and I've made it available to Ashley. She can, she's, as far as I'm concerned, she's welcome to simply attach it in the chat if anyone wants to have it while I read it. Or you can get it from her later if you're interested, okay? It takes about 24 or 25 minutes, and then I'll be around for as long as you guys want to talk. So my remarks today, I'm reading now, are taken from an article I just finished writing with the title, as Ashley said, Letter to a Young Philosopher, Don't Become an Effective Altruist. The article is a contribution to a collective project that began a few months ago in February of this year at an animal law and policy summit in Miami. The topic is, as the title indicates, effective altruism, which I'm going to refer to simply as EA. Although I assume most of you know quite a bit about what this is, I'm not going to take this for granted. So very roughly, here's my start. EA is a program for identifying and promoting social contributions that do the most good per expenditure of time or money, and that are in this sense most efficient. EA is the quite young brainchild of current Oxford philosophers, and Oxford philosophy is home to some relatively new institutes and programs that develop and make use of its ideas, such as the Global Priorities Institute, the Future of Humanity Institute, and Oxford Effective Altruism. The Animal Policy Summit I attended in February permitted time for casual conversation among a variety of activists. These included sanctuary managers, directors of nonprofits dedicated to ending factory farming, vegan educators, directors of veganism-oriented, anti-racist public health and food access programs, etc. It also included some academics. As some of the activists were talking, they got onto the topic of how charitable giving on EA's principles had either deprived them of significant funding or, through the threat of the loss of funding, pushed them to pursue programs at a variance with their missions. There was general agreement that EA was having a damaging influence on animal advocacy. Someone in the group suggested that we gather our perspectives on EA into an edited volume, and someone else proposed that we compose our respective thoughts in the forms of letters, as if to an effective altruist, explaining how, in our view, EA is problematic. The piece from which I'm drawing my talk today is my letter for this project. I don't have time to share the whole letter with you. I'm leaving out many passages, including descriptions of the actual work of EA-affiliated groups that rate animal charities. But here's a précis of what I do say. I'm going to briefly describe EA, then talk about 3 criticisms to which it's subject. First, there's the institutional critique, which I think is the best known, if also the least threatening to EA. Second, there's what I call the philosophical critique, which, as I present it, is different from other critiques, sometimes put under the same heading. And lastly, or third, there's the composite philosophical institutional critique, which I think is the most important. And after discussing all three, I'm briefly going to comment on the philosophical institutional critique in relation to discussions of EA's institutional culture. So here's a description of EA. It's important to take care in specifying what it is. The earliest accounts presented in broadly consequentialist terms, and consequentialist ideas inform the way EA is implemented by many groups. Consequentialism is a big tent, leaving room for many positions. Yet some advocates argue that it's not necessary for effective altruists even to be consequentialists, and others go farther, claiming that EA is independent of any theoretical commitments. That last phrase is from Jeff McMahan. Here I'll set aside the question of whether one can be an effective altruist without being a consequentialist. The consequentialist stances that figure in the articulation and actualization of EA presuppose a distinctive philosophical worldview, and we can move from criticism of this worldview to an attack on those aspects of EA that have been most destructive within the pro-animal community. The resulting non-consequentialist outlook makes it possible to expose this confused EA-style talk of doing most good, and to delegitimize evaluations of charitable organizations that presuppose the coherence of such talk. Consequentialism is the view that moral rightness is a matter of the production of the best consequences or best states of affairs. What's best is what has the most value, so consequentialist stances are grounded in prior theories of value. Within this scheme, consequentialists can, as many commentators have observed, be open about what things are assessed as right or wrong. They can talk about the rightness not only of actions, but also of anything else that has consequences, including sets of actions. Consequentialists can also be fairly open about what count as values, although we'll see their epistemological assumptions constrain their views. Effective altruists show their consequentialist stripes by locating themselves within the space of alternatives that consequentialism, as I just presented it, leaves open. During the brief history of EA, effective altruists have tended to take as the objects of moral assessment particular actions, while also taking as their core value the sort of well-being that can be measured with the metrics of welfare economics. These assessments are often complex, involving many steps, and I'm going to leave out details. There's a further respect in which effective altruists fly consequentialist colors. Consequentialists sometimes insist that moral reflection is undertaken from the point of view of the universe, accenting that they conceive such reflection as disengaged and maximally dispassionate. This abstract moral epistemology is one of the marks of a moral radicalism often celebrated by consequentialists. The morally radical suggestion is that our ability to act so as to produce value anywhere places the same moral demands on us as does our ability to produce value in our immediate practical circumstances. This radical twist on consequentialism's abstract moral epistemology is integral to two of effective altruist signature gestures. First, effective altruists inherit it when they exhort us to be guided by their recommendations in a way that treats as irrelevant the question of who is helped without favoring projects to which we have particular attachments. Second, effective altruists' characteristic injunctions are enjoinders to do the most good, and this gesture also depends on an abstract approach to moral epistemology. The approach excludes any virtue-oriented take on action that would enable us to construe rightness as appropriately engaged responsiveness to circumstance, making it seem more natural to account for rightness by looking to the value of the consequences produced. Consequentialists may, of course, hold that there are multiple kinds of valuable things, and there's never been a consensus among them about the relative weights of any sets of values. But it's still the idea that rightness is a matter of the value of quantifiable consequences that makes it seem coherent to speak EA style of single judgments about how to do the most good. EA's image of moral reflection as proceeding from a God's eye view places constraints on how we can conceive of values. It leaves no room for views on which values are only recognizable as such from engaged standpoints. Among the views excluded are various subjectivist views, as well as Kantian constructivist views of the kind Christine Korsgaard favors. Also excluded are views on which values are simultaneously woven into the fabric of reality and such that we require particular sensitivities to recognize them. This last exclusion is the one that matters most here. To many, it won't seem like an exclusion at all because it is so metaphysically and epistemologically heterodox. But at Oxford, if one overlooks the views in question, this is views on which values are simultaneously woven into the fabric of reality and such that we require particular sensitivities to recognize them. At Oxford, if one overlooks such views, one's forgetting a key stretch of local philosophical history. Such views figured prominently in 20th century Oxford moral philosophy, in particular in the work of a group of women philosophers at Oxford during and after World War II. This should be Anscombe, Foote, and Murdoch, and also others, Midgley, but the core group there. To forget this part of our philosophical heritage is to overlook notable resources for criticizing consequentialism, which can then be brought to bear on EA. So this brings me to the institutional critique. The class of things that for consequentialists are accessible as right or wrong can, in principle, we saw, include not only single actions, but anything that has consequences. The institutional critique attacks effective altruists for operating with a damagingly narrow interpretation of this class. The critique targets effective altruists' tendency to focus on single actions and their proximate consequences, and more specifically, to focus on simple interventions that reduce suffering in the short term. Advocates of the institutional critique are on the whole concerned to decry the neglect of coordinated sets of actions directed at changing social structures that reliably cause suffering. Insofar as the metrics that effective altruists use are designed to detect the short-term impact of particular actions, their tendency to discount the impact of coordinated actions can be seen as reflecting what's called measurability bias. A leitmotif of the institutional critique is that this bias veers towards obscuring the structural political roots of global misery. A number of effective altruists have responded to the institutional critique. Responses generally allow that some EA programs have placed undue stress on quantitative tools for capturing short-term effects of single actions, and that in overstressing the importance of relying on quantitative evidence, they have indeed demonstrated measurability bias. But the responses mostly also claim that properly understood EA calls on us to evaluate anything with relevant consequences, including systematic efforts to produce institutional change. The idea is that EA can treat the institutional critique as an internal critique that, instead of calling its commitments into question, obliges it to more faithfully realize its own core tenets. Now, I think it's right to credit these responses to the institutional critique with hitting their mark. I also think it would be wrong to conclude that effective altruists can simply treat the institutional critique as an internal one. The institutional critique can be given a philosophical twist that transforms it into a challenge to EA's core tenets. But to see this, we need to have before us the philosophical critique of EA. So here's the philosophical critique. The target of this critique is the abstract or God's eye moral epistemology that informs EA's understanding of itself as capable of arriving at single judgments about how to do the most good. The critique alleges that it's morally and philosophically problematic to construe moral reflection as abstract. Advocates of this critique sometimes represent themselves as building on a line of argument that Bernard Williams develops in publications in the 1970s and 1980s about how efforts in ethics to look at our lives from an Archimedean point oblige us to abstract from our most valued relationships and practices and represent a threat to our integrity. The effective altruists who respond to the philosophical critique tend to take Williams to be urging us to protect our integrity even at the cost of doing the wrong thing. They regard this solicitude towards the self as misplaced and self-indulgent, so they dismiss EA's philosophical critics' gestures as lacking in philosophical interest. The stance of these effective altruists is understandable. The interpretation of Williams they favor is textually reasonable and widely received. It's difficult to find a philosophical critique of EA that's elaborated precisely enough to make it clear that this take on it is inaccurate. But even so, there's good reason to think that this is, for effective altruists, a missed opportunity for fundamental self-criticism. It's not difficult to further develop philosophical critics' worries about a God's eye morality so that it rises to the level of a devastating objection. Suppose we bring together worries about point-of-view-less moral reflection with views about values of the sort I touched on a moment ago, on which concepts of values determine worldly patterns that aren't indifferently available. Now, the point of the philosophical critique isn't that effective altruists' moral epistemology imposes integrity-threatening moral demands. The simpler but more substantial point is that it deprives us of the very resources we need to recognize what matters morally. The philosophical critique brings into question effective altruists' very notion of doing the most good. As effective altruists use it, this phrase presupposes that the rightness of a social intervention is a function of its consequences, and that the outcome involving the best consequences counts as doing most good. This idea has no place within the ethical stance that underlies the philosophical critique. Adopting this stance is a matter of seeing the real fabric of the world as endowed with values that reveal themselves only to a developed sensibility. To see the world in this way is to leave room for an intuitively appealing conception of actions as right insofar as they exhibit just sensitivity to the worldly circumstances at hand. Accepting this appealing conception of action doesn't commit one to denying that right actions frequently aim at ends. Here, acting rightly includes acting in ways that are reflective of virtues such as benevolence, which do indeed aim at the well-being of others. With reference to the benevolent pursuit of others' well-being, it certainly makes sense to talk about good states of affairs. But it's important, this is a quote from Philippa Foot, that we found this end within morality, forming part of it, not standing outside it as a good state of affairs by which moral action in general is to be judged. Right action also includes acting when appropriate in ways reflective of the broad virtue of justice, which aims at an end, that is, giving people what they're owed, an end that can conflict with the end of benevolence. If we're responsive to circumstances, sometimes we'll act with an eye to others' well-being, and sometimes with an eye to other ends. In a case in which it's not right to improve others' well-being, it makes no sense to say that we produce a worse result. To say this would be to pervert our grasp of the matter by importing into it an alien conception of morality. If we keep our heads, we'll say that the result we face is, in the only sense that's meaningful, the best one. So there is here simply no room for EA-style talk of the most good. The philosophical critique confronts EA with challenges that it can't meet simply with internal adjustments. The suggestion of the critique is that EA's claim to be directing us to do the most good founders on a misunderstanding of the nature of morality, and that the enterprise needs to be either radically reconceived or abandoned altogether. So this brings me to the philosophical institutional critique. It's possible to deepen the philosophical critique by combining it with the institutional critique. The institutional critique alleges that EA disregards the kinds of systematic actions needed to affect social change, and the philosophical critique alleges that EA's God's eye moral epistemology wrongly restricts its views of what values are like. what might be called the philosophical institutional critique, and for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to call it the composite critique. The composite critique sounds themes from the philosophical critique in attacking EA's abstract moral epistemology, while sounding themes from the institutional critique in claiming that this commitment to abstraction deprives EA of resources necessary for describing the social world, disqualifying it from the task of assessing efforts to affect social change. The core of the composite critique is the idea that social phenomena are ontologically distinctive and that distinctive methods are required to bring them into focus. Social phenomena are taken to be irreducibly ethical and such that we require particular modes of affective response to see them clearly. Against this backdrop, EA's abstract epistemological stance seems to veer towards removing it entirely from the business of social understanding. It's not hard to find congenial accounts of the demands of moral thought. Social critics often attack abstract approaches to social relations for obscuring from view social structures that are internal to grave injustices. It's a leitmotif of important strands of feminist theory and critical race theory that gender-based and racist abuses aren't as such indifferently open to view, and that they only come into focus through the lens of the social suffering that systematic sexist and racist biased occasions. In suggesting that EA lacks the tools to illuminate social life, detractors from EA who sympathize with a composite critique may rightly represent themselves as aligned with these radical traditions. Within the consequentialist frame in which EA is at home, it seems unproblematic to couch moral assessment quantitatively in terms of doing the most good. And this seems to justify trafficking in the sorts of tropes of economic efficiency that effective altruists often use in their assessments. Some of the critics of EA who sound themes from the composite critique are especially hard on effective altruists for thus relying on economic instruments. Underlying this charge is a very particular diagnosis of our social condition. The thought is that the great social malaise of our time is the circumstance, which is sometimes taken to be the mark of neoliberalism, that economic modes of reasoning have overreached so that things once rightly valued in a manner immune to the logic of exchange have been instrumentalized. It's not merely that, in thus spilling outside their proper domain, instrumental categories are supposed to have become ideological, blocking us from seeing what social life is like. The task of arriving at a more just and faithful image of our lives is supposed to call for challenging the predominance of instrumental economic concepts by insisting on the very kind of practically and emotionally demanding thought that, according to the composite critique, is necessary for social understanding. Considered in this context, EA's reliance on economic terms to evaluate social interventions can seem like an insensitive insistence on speaking in the proprietary language of the illness. It can seem like EA's own advertisement of its inability to address our plight. We could summarize the force of the composite critique like this. Effective altruists are hampered by abstract methodological commitments that seem to speak against the very sort of engaged thought we need if we're to do descriptive justice to social relations and identify promising efforts at social transformation. Even if, through sheer luck, effective altruists hit upon well thought out social interventions to assess, their efforts will be marred by a confusion about what morality is that leads them to appeal to an empty notion of most good, instead of considering the rightness of the interventions themselves. Given these constitutional limitations, isn't it clearly wrong to have charitable giving be directed by EA? That would be a stopping point, but I'm going to conclude with just another minute and a half on debates about the institutional culture of EA. So it's possible to develop a criticism of EA's institutional culture that parallels the composite critique. As recently as 2015, a critic could plausibly observe that EA had, quote, so far been a rather homogeneous movement of middle-class white men. That's Amia Srinivasan, if you don't recognize it. Since then, proponents of EA and EA-affiliated groups have placed significant new stress on inclusiveness. These moves towards inclusiveness are designed not just to bring in participants with different social identities, but to make room for their distinctive standpoints and ideas. I could say a lot about these moves, and I mean to be genuinely complimentary. They're sincere, and they look like they're really put a lot of effort and thought into them, and have seen effects. So on the surface, these gestures are attractively non-tokenizing, but they're not accompanied by any acknowledgement of the extent to which the very framework of EA constrains available moral and political outlooks. EA's framing excludes views of values as real but indifferently inaccessible aspects of the world, views associated with the work of a set of women moral philosophers who were prominent at Oxford in the mid-20th century. It also excludes views of the demands of world-guided social thought as essentially perspectival, views associated with central currents of feminist and critical race theory, and also Marxist social theory. For all of the suggestive signaling towards diversity of ideas, EA as it stands cannot make room for individuals who find in these traditions the things they most need to say. For E to make space for these individuals, it would have to acknowledge that their moral and political beliefs pose threats to its guiding principles, and that these principles themselves are contestable. To acknowledge this would be to concede that EA as it's currently conceived might need to be given up. It would be to concede that EA is subject to a philosophical institutional critique that aims at its very foundations. Thank you. That's the end of what I'm bringing as the basis for discussion.
Thank you very much for that, Alice Crary. It's a very well articulated and rather comprehensive argument against joining EA. Yeah, we have lots of applauding members through emojis in the chat. Does anyone have any questions while you're formulating one, or like asking to ask a question in the chat? I would just like to ask Alice about the alignment with Amia's views here. So Amia would perhaps agree or think, based on her philosophical work, that yes, indeed, that the white male founders of EA did have good intentions at heart when constructing EA and its goals and its methods. However, the very institutional prejudices that are embedded into society that EA does not address are perhaps the cause of why EA does not address them, because the white male founders aren't affected by them, or do not have the sort of awareness or understanding of this sort of epistemology and metaphysical view of the way that we can think and see the world. I was wondering if you agreed with that, or if you had perhaps a more nuanced take on that.
It's a really good question, and I mean, you know, I sent around this 2015 article in the LRB of Amia's. I've talked to her about it, and she knows I have this project running, and I haven't sent it to her yet. But I mean to be tracking her views in some sense throughout. So if I were to say where she figures in the little set of notes that I presented you, I think she has a version of what gets called the philosophical critique. And I think she's pointing at something deeper than some of the defenders of EA have picked up when they've responded to her. So she's gotten different responses from philosophers defending EA. Jeff McMahan really dismissively, I think, said really she has nothing to add to the conversation. Somewhat more sympathetically, there's a recent piece by Peter Singer and Jeff Sebo that appeared in a book called Critical Terms for Animal Studies. where they're trying to talk about the prospects for productive EA-inspired activism in the animal world. And they credit her in other ways with drawing attention to issues of diversity, but I think she's doing something deeper. And I don't think, it's not as though I don't think there's room for me to come in and do something, because I think she was writing a very attractive and brilliantly written LRB piece where she wasn't going to go deeply into some of the philosophical themes. So I don't think she really shows, she does touch on Williams. She doesn't really show how she's going to do something with this philosophical corpus that goes beyond what some of the philosophers she's talking to are interested in. And then she brings in themes for what I call the composite critique, which really involve seeing EA's historical neglect of composite actions, something that, as many EA proponents have pointed out, it could overcome by treating them as objects of assessment. But she puts it in another light and suggests that there's a deeper problem, and that the philosophical critique is going to threaten your attempt to do more systematic social thought through the lens of EA. And so in a sense, I'm trying to tell a story which I think will, by sort of teasing these threads out, the institutional, the philosophical, how they come together in what looks like a quite devastating critique. Not that, I mean, critiques can be devastating, they can still be answered. Devastating doesn't mean you don't have anything to say in response, but it's devastating in the sense that it goes to the heart of EA. And I think that's where she is. That's what I believe. And I think she would agree with things I say at the end about how there can be really good intentions, and there is a lot of, like in the animal advocacy world, you see the staffs of a lot of agents, of a lot of EA rating agencies, like animal charity evaluators. If you look at the pictures of the staffs, you have an impression of diversity of social identity. And you also have various statements that are statements of commitment to listening to people and letting them share their experience, and not closing down people who have different ideas. I think those things are sincere, but they're not philosophically sophisticated about what EA is and how it still excludes voices and perspectives, for all your sincerity. And again, I think my guess is that Amia is on the same page, but I haven't run it by her yet.
Okay, thank you for that, Alice. We've got a question from Bella, if you'd like to go next.
Should I be reading in chat, or will you read it, say it?
No, I mean, I'm happy to speak if I can be heard right now.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can even turn on video, although I think the angle's not very good. Hello. Oh gosh. Right. Hi. Yeah. So I just wanted to ask. So if I understand your stance correctly, which I may not, that it's that ethical value is only accessible in certain contexts from certain standpoints. So this kind of like this impartial or universal idea is just like never gonna hit the mark. But I was wondering whether you think it might be enough, and maybe you don't actually from how you just answered that last question, but I'll ask anyway. Do you think it's enough to listen to and be directed by people who have access to these different standpoints, right? Like who are of certain marginalized identities, and ask them, how we might address these injustices, because they presumably have access to these kind of, I'm not sure what to call it, these values. For example, GiveWell has recently, although not done very much on this yet, been trialing asking people in the communities they want to help about their own moral values, and then trying to implement those or like use them in their decision making. And I wonder if you think like this is enough, or like could ever be enough if taken to a large enough extent, or whether that just isn't going to get us anywhere.
It's a really, really good question, Bella, because it has lots of different elements, and I'm aware of, spent a lot of time in lockdown, to be honest, spending time on these websites. And so I'm aware of some of these initiatives. And just to start off with, I think listening to people is incredibly important. So the idea that you know, if you want to be involved in an organization that's making an intervention, especially I mean, it could be within your own country, but a culture that you're not familiar with, to not be listening to voices on the ground is in some sense deadly. That doesn't mean they can't be listened to uncritically. I mean, they should be listened to fully uncritically, because you're, even within any culture, you're going to get a diversity of viewpoints. Thinking is still going to be required, but it should be listening and thinking with people who are there and who have, you know, direct experience of what life within certain institutional structures and social conditions are like. I gather your question really is, can we then go on and be effective altruists once we've done that? And it's hard for me to unpick it exactly for you, but the idea would be something like, I think I can think of exactly where in my talk this would go. You get your ideas about what a productive social intervention might be by listening to people. But if you're still an effective altruist, you're going to have some version of assessment in light of consequences with an eye to the most good. And from my perspective, so I think I said something like, even if through luck you wind up, and so this isn't luck, maybe it's through good methods you wind up with good social interventions to assess, you're still dealing with a confusion, I would say, about what morality is like, that's going to lead you not to look at the intervention itself, which may well aim at ends and ends that are very important, but you're going to treat its assessment as a matter of an appeal to ends, as it were, outside morality itself, that stand in judgment on them. And I think that can still be damaging, although it's really difficult to start thinking about these things then without talking about examples. Some of my examples in the project I'm drawing on are from animal advocacy and the kinds of things that that people in the field are doing that aren't being recognized by EA.
And of course, we have an added difficulty with my question. You know, in animal advocacy, we simply could not ask animals what they would like us to do.
Yeah, or it's complicated to say what that looks like. I mean, there are lots of debates within animal ethics about just that topic, what it would be to listen to animals themselves. And it's obviously a different kind of activity. I think most people who work in the field of animal ethics and who are activists probably aren't going to say what you said just as bluntly as you did, because they think there is this important activity, which is sort of being observant about the extent to which animals can exercise autonomy and in some sense show us what it is they want. But yeah, it's a really good question. And so in the end, I think, no, it's not enough. So just to give it a simple answer.
Okay,
Thank you.
Great, thanks. That's a really interesting question. Next we are going to hear from Kieran.
I'm really sorry, actually. I think that answers my question as well. Apologies.
That's okay.
No apology.
We'll go ahead to Felix, who has a question. We've got plenty of questions here.
Hiya. I really liked what you had to say and have an awful lot of sympathy with it. I wanted to ask why you think that long-termism, which is like Auden McCaskill's big thing, has seemed to be kind of generated by EA or utilitarian points of view, and whether or not you think it's possible to take a view over many generations or many centuries or even cosmic timescales, using a more value focused ethics, or not using that kind of with a more attention to social forms maybe, or not using that kind of EA framework.
So
how would you see that working?
You're thinking of the kind of thing that the Future of Humanity Institute is doing. Is that it?
Yeah, what does that look like? I think everyone would agree, right, that we should think long term and think about the future where possible. So what does that look like when we kind of dispense with an EA framework?
Yeah. I don't know if I'm gonna start with generalities and then work back. And I don't know I don't know if I have. I'm starting at the moment a really big project on ethics in the Anthropocene and what that looks like. And it is, in a sense, an attempt to grapple with the kinds of questions that you're asking. One thing is, here, I'm going to say something silly, which I hope you all enjoy. But my children at the moment are really into watching the Marvel Comics movies. And I'm going to get the name. Is it Thanos, who like thinks, Thanos is the guy who thinks he's the great evil in the Avengers movies. And my kids, my older child who's attuned to what I do, she was like, he's like the guy doing effective altruism. He's going to kill off a third of the people in the universe because then everybody else can live well. And anyway, so one could be horrified at some of the forms of thinking that get associated with these long-term projections. It certainly doesn't mean that we don't want to be thinking about, we have to be thinking about future generations, and future generations are a problem for ethics. I don't think that we're cut off from thinking about future generations just because we abandon the consequentialist framework. I think that's the key to your question. Are we really not thinking about future generations if we're not thinking in this impersonal God's eye view style of EA or of classic consequentialism? And I just don't think that's true. I mean, we can be thinking about, I think the part of the talk which is most relevant is just thinking about the extent to which a typical account of what the virtues are allow us, in fact, oblige us to think about the ends of our actions. And we're not cut off at all from thinking our benevolence had better extend to people in the future. We need to also think about what it means for human life. A kind of value inquiry, it would be difficult to imagine within the framework of EA, what is the significance of human life that we're in a sequence of generations? And can we even imagine what our lives are like without projecting them into the future through human beings who come after us? Things like I can't think of the novelist who wrote the book, but the movie is, and the book are called Children of Men. So the sort of experiment. So it's not I don't have a full, like, what's my institute for looking at the future going to look like, if that's what you want. But the idea that somehow this one way of doing long-termism is the only way strikes me as just wrong.
Okay, thanks, Alice, and thanks, Felix. Now we're going to hear from Alice, another Alice.
Thanks. Mine's kind of more, it's like a scenario with a couple questions I wanted to ask about coming off it. And I'm curious about, since we're talking about the God's eye point of view, how EA would stand, or if it would stand in your thoughts on a non-realist framework, because like realism doesn't entail EA, but I don't think you can go backwards. Like if you've got EA, I don't think it seems like, from what I've, like, not idealist, but say like there are other philosophies that just don't uphold realism. And so to me, I don't see that it would be able to stand on a non-realist framework. And obviously there are a lot of philosophies that don't have realist frameworks, and those tend to be outside mainstream Anglo-American, like contemporary philosophy. And so I'm worried that we preemptively cut them off from even like assuming immoral to even consider them, because EA is being held up as moral, or our philosophical activity, once we see it as moral, is being directed, like there's time and resources to figuring out ethical action on an EA framework, rather than, like you said, like questioning the EA framework. And if other people don't have their values existing even within a realist framework, that would seem to question also our right to intervene if they're just like functioning on an entirely different like metaphysical worldview.
Did you say you had 2 questions?
Well, I'm curious if you think those things follow, or how we would deal with those things.
Well, I kind of need to hear more about what kind of non-realist frameworks you have in mind, but I can say a bunch of structural things, which is, I do think that there are other standpoints from which to criticize at least aspects of EA, other than the one I walked through. The one that I walked through interests me, well, partly because I think it's right. I don't know what else to say along those lines, but also because it connects resistance to EA, or one sense of what's gone wrong when we're organizing our social outreach through EA, with radical traditions which I think need to be reclaimed, or I'd like to see reclaimed, must be reclaimed if we're going to be thinking in a way that's world directed, in a responsible and has critical bite. So I wasn't sure whether you were most interested in whether we could run ideas about EA in a non-realist framework, or whether we could resist from a non-realist framework. You're most interested in resistance, is that right?
Yeah, I'm worried that it cuts off conversation, and so if you have if it's only tenable on a realist framework, are people being left out of the conversation whose culture, like cultural philosophies, don't support a realist framework? It institutionally cuts off people from participating in conversation. But if you could envision EA on a non-realist framework, then that also wouldn't be an option. So I was curious if you thought.
Well, I think one place for you to look at, Alice, I don't tend to call you just Alice, Alice Hank, I don't know. One place to look is this debate, which is so familiar, and I think has become really weary, between critics of EA and who invoke Williams, and defenders of EA. And I intentionally avoided going into Williams' exegesis. I think Williams fascinating. I've spent a lot of my life reading him. But he gets used here as a kind of argumentative whip, and the problem, I think, for someone, it depends on what kind of non-realist view you have. But here you have Williams showing up. This isn't quite right for him, but he shows up as a kind of non-realist. He's worried about the idea that this is the textbook Williams that's showing up here. He's worried about the idea that certain things that are important ethically only show up for us in a disengaged way. So he seems like he's pushing back against EA, but he doesn't seem to be saying very strongly that that those things can survive the kind of the things that come into view from an engaged standpoint can survive critical reflection and be affirmed as theirs. So it seems possible for the defenders of EA to say, we don't want the kind of worry about, let's say, you could think of it, if you're thinking of other cultures, the kind of integrity I have as someone who's going to look at what's going on through the lens of my cultural values, to keep me from doing what's actually right. And the argument that you are going to have then is between the defender of EA who says, well, I'm talking about something objective, which is actually right. And you're just talking about how things happen to appear. And as much as, I mean, there are often sympathetic noises, we sympathize with that, but we want to bring it under the rubric of an authoritative morality. It's a difficult conversation to have. And since I don't sympathize fully with the views, I sympathize with a lot in Williams, and I think there are parts of his work that point in the direction that I go and parts that don't. But since I'd like to radicalize his thought about needing to look at things through the lens of one's attachments and values, and not thinking that the morally correct point of view is always one that obliges me to step back from all of those things. That I would take from him. And since I go with him I go farther, I wind up in a position I assume you're thinking of as realist. I think the conversation for the non-realist is harder.
Yeah.
Hard. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, both Alices. The next question is from Lewis.
Hello.
Hello, Lewis.
Just wanted to start by saying thank you for the excellent talk. That was very interesting. I think there's a lot to be kind of taken from it. And I'm also going to preface this by apologizing for probably the philosophical naivety and perhaps also bluntness with which I'm going to try and ask my question. So as far as I understand it, EA tends to focus on this kind of welfarist perspective towards moral value, because this seems kind of quite robust across many different value systems. And it might be that there are kind of many other sources of kind of suffering and moral value within kind of this kind of social life kind of, or kind of the social sphere that you were talking about. And maybe that's EA is kind of less well placed to address. And so the first thing there, I think, is maybe that EA could maybe potentially make a concession about what it calls the most good, and kind of be more kind of modest about exactly the kinds of good it is focusing on. And then I just wanted to kind of, my main kind of point, I suppose, or thing I wanted to follow up with there, is that, again, I'm not totally sure I understand exactly what kind of moral values you're talking about kind of within the social life. But I suppose one rebuttal or one kind of something against this might be that these kind of maybe kind of social issues or more kind of systemic problems might have to wait to be solved until millions of people aren't starving to death. And a kind of more contentious way to put this would be, in fact, to say that people arguing for the fact that these systemic or kind of more kind of nuanced social issues are going neglected by EA are precisely the ones that are, in fact, maybe kind of more privileged and they can afford to think about these issues because, in fact, they aren't, say, living on a few dollars a day or something. And so these concerns, these other social concerns seem more pressing to them because they are in that kind of very fortunate position. I hope that was vaguely coherent, and I'd be
It's
very
totally
interested.
coherent. It's a recognizable conversation from within these, in the sort of critical discussions of EA. And some of the points are really important. And the reason I don't feel defensive about them at all is just simply that I think they need to be reoriented a little bit. So I think if I back down in terms of who's making these points and who's raising these criticisms, at the moment I'm working from within animal advocacy. And so they're going to register differently. And we should probably talk about that case, what welfarism looks like in industrial animal agriculture versus attempts at system change. And that's a really important context because, you're talking about billions of animals who don't have lives worth living, which are, so it's a perfect case for that, what that balance looks like between these two perspectives. But let me say a few things. So it would be possible for effective altruists to take the position that you suggested that they're taking, and probably some do, although the main philosophical voices that I know don't. So they don't back down and say, this is what EA is best at doing, this kind of welfarist intervention. That's actually not the position they've tended to take. They've been very, in general, I can think of 3 or 4 or 5 voices, people who've been very respectful of economists, especially people focusing on development, and political theorists who've made the institutional critique as I presented it, so independently of what I call the philosophical critique that can be joined with it. And they've tended to be concessive, and I think I said this, and to treat the criticism as an internal one. So then the idea is actually no, that there's nothing about what EA is which prevents it from doing these things. And it can change its metrics so that it's capable of assessing consequences. So my sense of the conversation is that's where it is. If EA was to, if somebody who was defending EA was to go the direction you were suggesting, that that EA should just say, look, we're really good at these kinds of things. Wouldn't that be a way of saving the mission of EA? I think that's what part of your question, and just, you know, making it slightly more local, but saying this is a really important thing to do. And in general, my answer to that kind of move in defenses of EA would be certainly various welfarist, which sort of welfarist moves which hold hands with, say, humanitarian responses, depending on the context. They're really important, but I think you want them to be undertaken by people who have a broader social vision. Because the worry that some of the development economists are raising is that in some cases, you're right, misery, you know, after an outbreak, we can easily all relate to this now, or in a place where we think political mobilization is impossible because levels of disease and childhood death are so high, various kinds of welfarist interventions might just be utterly meaningful. You want that to be within the framework of someone who has a sense of what structural changes would be needed, not to reproduce the misery generation after generation, and who was sensitive to the possibility that, and this is the kind of thing that some of the Nobel, some of the major economists have made, is that you wanted them to be sensitive to the possibility that welfarist interventions can, in some cases, serve to weaken existing political structures and make it even likelier that the abuses will continue. I think that if we were talking about the case of animals in factory farming, I think that worry is huge. And I think that the lives of animals in factory farming are so awful that some of the welfarist adjustments that EA, like groups like the Farm Animal Welfare Group with open, within the Open Philanthropy Project, and animal charity evaluators, and there's another group called Faunalytics. They're trying hard to assess attempts at structural change also, but overwhelmingly, I just did an analysis of ACE's Animal Charity Evaluators 2019 ratings. They're overwhelmingly still rewarding the most efficient organizations at producing welfare improvements. I think that industrial animal agriculture is arguably so bad that it's not clear what to feel about it. Like, yeah, it's nice for a chicken who's going to live not very long in situations which are disease fostering, and is going to be slaughtered under horrible circumstances, to move a little bit more, or to not have its beak chewed off by another chicken. I mean, these are the kinds of things we're talking about, and they're pretty awful to contemplate. But I think what you want is an animal protectionist movement where you have advocates thinking about what would be required for real structural change, and about the danger of simply allowing meat and representatives of the meat industry to advertise their own welfare credentials in a way that makes what they're doing more palatable and ensures its perpetuation. So the concessive move is to say there's room for the kind of welfarist intervention. I'm happy to say things like that, but I would want it to be integrated within the kind of systematic social thought, whether we're talking about human beings, in which case I'm going to want to be talking to development economists and political theorists, or whether we're talking about animals, in which case I know a lot of people who are good at these things, intersectional animal activists. I would want the welfarist movement to be integrated, not an independent thing that doesn't acknowledge its place within the larger social vision. I hope that's an answer to your question. I think they're really important issues. And one of the things I've found disappointing or just hard about discussions of EA is the idea that somehow all the good people are on one side or the other. And I don't think that's true. I think you have people who see themselves as really committed, even at the cost of sacrifices to themselves, to productive social interventions on both sides, but on both sides. And I want some of the activists whose work is impacted by the ratings of EA affiliated groups to be heard too.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have a question from Jack.
Hi, Alice.
Hi, Jack.
Really enjoyed it. One thing I sort of want to ask about is chiming into something that's in Amia Srinivasan's piece regarding the sort of metaphysic and epistemology that EA assumes. And so one of the things that is discussed is McCaskill's response to his own affective sympathies.
Yes.
Someone thanks him once he visits them, but he treats that in some sense as arbitrary. It's not something you can stake an ethical decision on, because the affective is arbitrary, that he was there, is contingent, and therefore can't sort of be rationalized or be part of the rational. But one thing that I think that the piece sort of touches on is that economic conditions that factor in to the choices that the effective altruist is going to make are in a sense as contingent as the effective. That the effective altruist doesn't understand that their actions unthinkingly perpetuate the same economic conditions or aspects of the economic world that they haven't ever thought over. And so strangely enough, Jeff McMahan is very dismissive to Amia's objection, but despite the fact that I think in the same sort of surveying piece, he says that, well, some developmental economists have made some good points, but it was so strange. But
we'll keep it strange.
Yeah. I suppose my question is, from your view, how do we deal with the historical and the contingent, but also thinking about how there is something about our effective lives that is always, for want of a better phrase, thrown or random, and that we are each lucky in our capacities that we're sort of given to bring into view aspects of the world.
I like this question, and I'm going to have to think about how to answer it in a way that is satisfying for you. One of the things is the notion of the contingent is just a really good one and is ripe for philosophical investigation, because there's a sense in which our attachments and who we're connected to and which projects we can see the point of, those are contingent things. And so in that sense, we're thrown. I like the Heideggerian concept. On the other hand, if you want to shift to Hegel instead of Heidegger, in the process of being thrown, we really do learn to think. One of the ways of capturing the difference between, say, the kind of philosophical vision I think Amia has and someone like Peter Singer or Jeff McMahan had is the idea that that thinking well, where that means thinking authoritatively, this again may distinguish the kind of answer I'm going to give from the direction Alice Hank wanted to go, but thinking authoritatively, where that means doing a better job at bringing the social world into view, does not mean denying those aspects of who we are. So there's a sense in which things are, Hilary Putnam once said this, they're contingent, but not contingently contingent. You are doing critical thinking, at least by my lights and certainly by Amia's, when you're turning on yourself and trying to figure out whether the way that the perspective from which you've been led to look at a social phenomenon is leading you into a projective illusion, or whether it's revealing to you something that's really there. That's one of the ways of describing, sort of in imagistic terms, what critical thought looks under those circumstances. And so there's room for, certainly for someone who's resisting EA, I think this came out a bit in my response to Lewis, there's certainly room to think we've got to be in conversation with other people about what a kind of altogether productive, more systematic approach, at least to say in a particular area, to intervening in this area. But your worries about the good you can do locally, I think lots of people do small, local, wonderful things, and sometimes need funding for them. And I think one of my concerns is a kind of quantified approach that's characteristic of EA that makes it look like that at least can't be endeavors that you want to support. You want that big picture, but you don't need to necessarily at every moment think that the humble local good that you're doing is somehow questionable. Simply because, I mean, you would hope that should you arrive at a larger social vision that doesn't leave place for it, you would question what you were doing. But if you do, that larger social vision doesn't need to be an EA framework that would allow you to show you're doing the most good. So in their sense, the most good in their sense. So, I mean, one of the words the most good are just words, and we could try to resuscitate them for other moral and political outlooks, but I don't find them terribly helpful, even though I can imagine trying to resuscitate them and find a use for them. But think some of the, you could be doing good sanctuary work, just to sanctuary managers as a whole are a group of people who aren't particularly fondly looked upon by effective altruists. And there are even internal debates among sanctuary managers about whether really what they should be doing is simply creating conditions under which the rescued farm animals can live in a manner that is consistent with respectful treatment of them, or whether they should be incorporated into educational outreach programs which are designed to, which may not involve treating animals in the best possible way, but are designed to make them kinds of, to use the language of the trade, ambassadors to convert more human beings to the cause. And I think those are important conversations. I don't even think the answer is easy. I think to some extent sanctuaries can do both things, but I think we can sort of, one of the reasons to criticize EA in connection with animal advocacy is to reframe the kinds of questions that we're asking about the value of what these different groups are doing. So it's not necessarily the case that the sanctuary that refuses to have certain educational programs that involve instrumentalizing the animals and using them as educational tools, even if they don't, they can't document and presumably don't convert as many human vegan activists, they're not necessarily doing less good because we're not using that frame anymore.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jack, for the question. Thanks, Alice Crary. I was wondering, Alice Crary, how much time do you have? Do you have time for another question? Or
I was like, I think I do. I can't see, I have you on full screen, which means I can't tell what time it is. I'll take you off full screen and then I'll know. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine.
So Issei, or Issei, if you'd like to ask a question. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name.
Yeah, that's fine. So can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I have two questions. So I think like the most important EA idea, from my perspective, is the sense of ethical prioritization. And I wonder if you think that's, first, is that important? And secondly, if you're not an EA, how do you prioritize between actions? Or when you're not doing anything like wrong, for example, like the thing about EA is that there's something more you can do. There's always something more you can do, but that's not always true of other ethical theories. So if you're not an EA, how do you prioritize ethically? Thank you.
I think I might reject the question as a way of answering it, at least part of it. I think it's a good question. Ethical prioritization, if you think of that as the key idea of EA, where the idea is, if it involves a kind of quantification, which is internally connected to the idea that we can meaningfully rank different groups in terms of their efficient production of the most good, then I'm arguing for rejecting that framework. That we can definitely do lots of assessment of what different charitable organizations are doing, but if you reject, as I do, as a confused vision of morality, the consequentialist framework, you're not going to have an obvious use. This was something I was just talking about. You're not going to have an obvious use for the idea of the most good as measured by an outcome with such and such state of affairs. You're going to be looking at things like in interacting with people, or in the case of animals, with animals. I'm going to think about benevolence as the AA's prime virtue. I'm going to care about benevolence, but there are other things to be concerned about. And I don't want to do something that's unjust simply because it improves the lot of people better than doing what needs to be done. So in that sense, ethical prioritization, if it's in the terms of EA, is not something that I would affirm if it's quantitative and is about ranking groups in terms of who does the most good. That doesn't mean that we can't talk about more. And some of the lines that you get in the work of people like Amia Srinivasan, and there are other critics like Lisa Herzog of effective altruism, will say things like, it's not that EA asks us to do too much, it asks us to do the wrong things, or even it doesn't demand enough. Now, the idea that it doesn't demand enough is going to be something like the kind of social thinking that we need to do to figure out what kind of intervention or contribution we could make to make a difference is much harder than EA is envisioning. So you say how to do prioritization. I'm not opposed to the idea of, I mean, there were before EA, there were things like different groups who were rating the work that that charitable organizations were doing. And I've used as a private citizen interested in which groups I should support. I've used some of those rating systems before. Peter Singer's on record as saying what he doesn't like about the existing strategies of these charity raters. One of them's called, I think it's just called Charity Navigator. Charity Navigator, I might have that wrong, but I think that's right, is that they don't rate outcomes. That is roughly that they're not doing EA. But one of the things Charity Navigator was doing was drawing your attention to the mission and giving you a kind of qualitative assessment of its significance, and then also talking about the institutional organization and drawing your attention to charities that had, roughly speaking, smaller overhead. They were able to devote more of their resources directly to their stated mission. that doesn't give you by itself a ranking. I'm not sure that rankings are what we want, but we could go farther beyond traditional charity evaluators and talk about, we can imagine institutes in which people are looking at different areas of the world and trying to do the kinds of systematic social thinking that would allow us to locate in a broader vision the kinds of contributions that different activist movements, different grassroots movements, different NGOs, different charitable organizations have to contribute, and see them as coordinated. That's the kind of thing I have in mind. So it's not my prioritization as if it would sit in parallel to what effective altruism is doing. But if you wanted to do more, it would certainly give you a view of the kinds of things that need to be done in the world. And there's always more to be done, even if we're not thinking in terms of quantitative reasoning. You can certainly always do more.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alice. Iso, if you have a reply to that, you can do. Otherwise, we have another question from Kieran. Is there going to be a reply?
Hi.
Hi, Kieran.
Okay, Kieran. Yeah, go for it.
There's a reply.
Oh, is there?
Someone just posted in the chat, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Kieran.
Okay, sorry. Thinking about my question now, I'm worried that you might have already answered it, but it's just, as I understand it, one of the central philosophical points of Amia Srinivasan's LRB piece was a difference between the individual locus of practical reason and some other locus of practical reason, like a state or a class or something like that. And I feel I understood the points about standpoint epistemology, but I feel I might have missed something more on the practical side of things. So in terms of how one gathers information, how one conceives of the project of acquiring information and stuff like that, I can understand how you might have a different perspective to the EA one. I don't quite understand what the alternative perspective is to the individual locus of practical reason, though I'm sure you've hinted at it or said it. So I just wanted to ask more clarification on that, basically. Does that make any sense?
I'm sure it makes sense. I have to think about where a good answer might be. I hadn't thought of, I did not just reread Amia's piece, although I've read it many times, and I didn't think, did you have a particular passage of it in mind that you wanted to read?
Sure.
Read it?
I don't have it up with me, sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But it's towards the end, and then it's something that Jeff McMahan responds to in particular, because he says, I am not an institution or a state, I am a person, or something like that. It's that exchange.
So that's where, got it. That's where he's thinking, right. Yeah, I mean, I think these, I hadn't focused on this element of their exchange in particular. It was more his dismissal of what she was doing that had interested me, and I was trying to account for where he was coming from. And then also to explain that although I could sympathize with where he was coming from, I didn't think that was really the end of the story. But here, yeah, it's the idea that what we're thinking about in EA is, maybe going back to Iso's question, I'm going to, obviously it's going to be a reflection of me and my talents and my time and my money, but I'm going to figure out how I can, in some sense, intervene in an ongoing causal system and do the most good. And Amia's talking about something else. And that's what Jeff McMahan is responding to. I think if we move towards, and we are still individuals and we're still making individual contributions, but we can, if we're in conversation with radical social traditions, if we're in conversation with a broad range of people in the context in which we have a sense that things really need to be done to address suffering, to address political systems that reproduce it, we're going to have an image of intervening with an eye to things that are systematic. At least this is what I think Amia is saying. So I mean, one of the difficulties, right, is, I mean, we can see it playing out right now in the US and around the world, is you might have sympathized with Black Lives Matter, you might have gone out as an individual and marched and supported, but you're looking for a movement to take off, or it's not going to have traction. And this is really difficult in the sense, one of the things we can say right now is it's not unlikely that one of the conditions of the current power and success of Black Lives Matter is the pandemic itself, because it exacerbated existing inequalities and brought them to the surface and made them intolerable. And it is probably part of the condition. And also there's the fact that people have been locked up and maybe eager to go out on the streets. It can be, these things can be complicated, but in a sense, what you're acting, when you're acting, is part of that movement, even though it's you acting as yourself. And the thinking that you're putting into that is a thought about what things need, in this case with the Black Lives Matter, going back to just to Lewis's question, you know, there may be things that you think that even Black Lives Matter should have on its radar in terms of simply helping people who are suffering, but it's a movement aimed at social transformation. And there you're thinking about yourself as an agent of a larger movement. And that's really different from thinking, what can I do with my money that has the biggest effect? Or what can I do with my time? EA isn't all about it, even if it seemed at first that way. It's not all about giving money.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you for the response and thank you for the talk.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kieran, for that question. Thank you so much, Crary. So as we are sort of running out of time, would you like to give a summary of what you said, or any just basically finalizing notes, any thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I've done a lot of talking, so I don't know what to add, except maybe something methodological in this case is, and going back to Ashley's remarks at the beginning about expressions of solidarity with what's going on right now, and bringing out that in our philosophical lives, which brings us into alignment, shows our own solidarity and our desire to make sense of, contribute, promote the social movements that most interest us and that seem most valuable and necessary and urgent at the moment. I should say that I had in view to do this project as long as a year and a half ago. I did the research for it, I put it away. And for me, it really was sitting with activists who were talking about how EA had affected them that pushed me back into doing what I had wanted to do. I think I had the sense that there was a philosophical institutional story to be told about limits of EA. And even if it gets picked apart in some places, I have the strong sense it hasn't been given its full due, and so just hasn't gotten aired. But what helped me was listening to people who are actually affected. And I think that's been missing, and it's good advice for anybody who wants to do world-directed or public-facing philosophy is, yes, you should definitely be good philosophers, know your traditions, know all their resources, and also look outside them. But you have to listen to the world too. And the world sometimes has things to tell us that we need to hear. Listening is active. There, is that a good end?
It was, that was great. That was absolutely wonderful. Yeah, what a good statement about what it is to be a good philosopher, and also rather radical work that I'm very thankful that you've been doing. I think now is also a good time to mention to people what next week's session will be on. So Oxford philosopher Rachel Fraser will be giving us a talk also relating to institutionalized oppression and responses to it for social transformation. And this is a premiere for her talk's description. So it goes as follows. Feminists can seem to face a dilemma. On the one hand, the feminists have been historically suspicious of the state, seeing it as the linchpin of a patriarchal order. On the other, any feminism worthy of the name must take seriously and oppose sexual violence. Carceral feminism represents one attempt to solve the dilemma. Carceral feminists seek to use the power of the state for feminist ends by wielding state power against perpetrators of sexual violence. I give some examples of carceral feminism before showing why carceral feminism is incompatible with a commitment to intersectionality. So tune in next week for that.
Sounds fascinating.
And yeah, thank you very much. I'll stop recording now.